Here we have Freud's major observation, that there is a subterranean process, an unconscious process, that's in deadly conflict with this young man's attempts to govern himself. It generates pleasure, but also fear and anxiety. Fear for himself, but also for those he loves. It is, we might say, a Hobbesian fear. But this young man, more than most, has unusual difficulty in signing up to the social contract that would offer protection against the fear. He is, like all of us, though perhaps more so, a divided self. He is a dissented subject, for whom the social contract is a sacrificial contract that he resents even as he assents to it. Freud, of course, thinks back into the history of this young boy's relations to his parents and others, his sisters, the housemaids, etc., and organises the analysis around interpretations of the various ways in which the young man responds to and tells stories about these experiences. So one of these is that as a very young boy, he was perhaps between the ages of 3 and 4, Ernst had done something naughty. He can't now remember quite what it was. Perhaps it was playing sexual games with his sister or with one of the housemaids, and he certainly did do this. Or perhaps it was simply that he'd bitten someone. In any case, what he does know is that his father beat him. His father punished him, and in response, the little boy flew into a rage, and he hurled abuse at his father. Having no bad language, as it were, to use at this moment, he resorted to the name of common objects. So he screamed at his father, "You lamp, you towel, you plate, you spoon, you fork, you kettle," and so on. Now, although on first impression a rather cute story, I think we shouldn't fail to notice that here we have a moment of terror, violence and fury. The resort to naming the father as a series of familiar, inanimate objects is itself a dehumanising move. And it's reinforced by the indication that from this time forward, Ernst was a coward. A coward not exactly out of fear, but rather out of fear of the violence of his own rage. Now, if the young Ernst was almost lost for words, these words of abuse, one of the major aspects of the case is the way a whole series of words come to signify the Ratman's unresolved ambivalence. His ambivalence in that he loves and hates Gisela, his father, etc. So, this is what Freud terms a regular rat currency that plays through the case. There are then various scenes that are retold of biting, of worms in his anus when he's a little boy, just like the rats in the story from the East, of rats at his father's grave, which he sees when he visits on one occasion, of rats being killed, which he experiences on another occasion. But also, there are a set of what we might call little rat signifiers, which, like so many rats' tails, hang off a series of words that accumulate in the analysis. So we have Spielratte, which was a reference to his father, the gambler. We have Hofrat, which is a new honorific attached to Fräulein Lena. Fräulein Lena had been one of the nursemaids with whom he'd played these sexual games when he was a very little boy. And subsequently she marries a judge and takes on this honorific title. So a very significant move up the ladder of social mobility, as it were. We also have the worries about the cost of the analysis and a kind of condensation between Raten and Ratten, rate and rats. So in a massive condensation, which is of course entirely unconscious, the signifier rat inserts itself throughout all aspects of the case. It is as if the words he didn't have when he was a violent but impotent child have taken form but remained unconscious around the image and significance of the rat. So in the process of trying to become a civilised subject, via the various psychic mechanisms that Freud tells us about: repression, identification, splitting, projection. The young boy who becomes the young man whom Freud meets has established a boundary between the human and the animal, in this case the almost domestic, dirty, homely, hence uncanny animal. He represses this, yet it emerges all over the place in his life and reveals itself in the analysis itself. He uses the repression, however, this splitting and dividing of himself, even though he uses it very unsuccessfully, to present himself as a loving son, a suitable husband, and a competent worker. He's always trying to convince people that this is what he is. So the Ratman attempts to intentionally reveal himself to Freud. He turns up, he tells him about himself and his ambitions, etc. But he, of course, reveals more than he intends to tell. So he intends to tell Freud about how he is this loving son, this loyal fiancé, this ambitious law student who somehow finds himself assaulted by thoughts and feelings that are quite alien to him. And that he has to work very hard to subdue these and keep them at bay. But in the very process of telling this story about himself, he gives himself away, as it were. There's something in his speech that insists and persists, that repeats and that's eventually heard, first by Freud and then by the Ratman himself. This is the regular rat currency, as Freud puts it, that accumulation of rat signifiers that keep recurring in his speech. Now, I think, as we can see it from this case, Freud argues that the formation of the human subject takes place in a world of self and others, a world of bodies and parts of bodies, of sensations, memories, and fantasies. It proceeds through processes of repression, incorporation, identification, internalisation, and the entry into culture and language. To achieve a capacity to speak and act in the world, we come to exercise a degree of sovereignty over ourselves. But this is always subject to disruption by the unconscious. The achievement of psychic organisation always leaves traces that persist. Our apparent sovereignty, then, is achieved at a cost. The repudiation of aspects of self and others, of bodies and parts of bodies, of sensations, memories and fantasies, of desires that can't be incorporated into the organisation of the ego or the I that I take myself to be. This positing of an I emerges from the capacity to locate or situate that I within culture as a speaking subject, as an acting subject, who has some capacity to decide, to choose, and to respond. What we've seen, I think, is that this achievement of an I that can act, choose, and respond involves the splitting of the subject. Part of what is split off, part of what becomes unfamiliar or uncanny, is those aspects of the self and the relation to others that have been repudiated and repressed in the process of establishing an ego. These repressed, split-off aspects remain as part of the unconscious, but the ego or the censor resists recognising them. So they're present but resisted and censored. However, they have been preserved as part of the psychic organisation, a repressed part, and they insist on some form of representation. Now, one way they find expression is by being projected on to actual others in ways that dehumanise them or mark them as evil or dangerous, or some such categorisation that renders the other as a suitable object of exclusion or aggression or hatred. Hence, these repressed feelings, these aspects of our experience, these hostilities, these aggressivities that we can't manage to contain within that construction of ourselves as a somewhat sovereign subject, return of the repressed and escape into the field of social relations, where of course they have social effects. They fuel ideologies of dehumanisation and discrimination, for instance. Freud always emphasised that we are born into a state of helplessness and dependency, and that in order to compensate for this uneasy state, we rely on fantasy. So we imagine ourselves as more in control and more capable of arranging the world to our liking than is actually possible. A phrase that Freud used about infants is His Majesty the baby, or we might add Her Majesty the baby. He's actually referring to a painting which, from what I can tell, is of a little boy. The phrase is, of course, a commonplace attempt to characterise the odd situation we're all in as human infants, where at once we're both helpless and dependent on others in order to survive, and yet we imagine ourselves to be omnipotent. Hence, the task we all confront is the task of finding a more mature and reality-oriented way of both surviving and thriving within a particular social arrangement, the one that we inherit from our parents through birth, etc. To do that while also satisfying our desires, some of which run contrary to the values, norms and rules of our society. So as we move from being a helpless infant, dependent on the care of others, while imagining ourselves as omnipotent, to becoming a somewhat competent and socially accepted adult, we need to accomplish a very difficult task or trick. The trick of becoming self-civilizing, self-organising, self-policing and self-governing. This then, for all of us, is a story about the psychic life of power and authority. How do we become a would-be civilised subject, and what are the discontents that this process leaves in its trail? These are the sorts of questions that Freud raises. Cases like the Ratman are so interesting because they provide such vivid evidence of the unconscious. One of the things that Freud suggests, drawing on this, is the ego is not master in its own house. The ego, of course, tends to imagine itself to be master in its own house, but it's not. It's constantly being undercut. It's constantly being caught between the power of the unconscious and the censoring agency, or the power of the id and the attempted control of the superego. So in the last little while, I want to move on to something that I was suggesting I'd try to do a bit of right at the outset. Because, of course, so far I've been talking about individual cases, and I hope at least I've managed to convey the way in which the complexity of an individual case has this depth to it, has this, what Rorty calls this everyone's life is like a poem aspect to it. I suggested that that's the very reason that we turn to psychoanalysis. It's this strength of being able to tell us about a life or about a social process in all its continuities, but also its discontinuities, its absences, its lacks, its repressions, its other side, or its other sides. And I also suggested that it's very difficult to achieve this trick when you move away from the individual to the broader social field. In particular, I might refer to a concept which Dennis Wrong has used to try to address this. He talks about the over-socialised conception of man. And what he's suggesting here is that too often, in drawing on psychoanalysis within the social sciences particularly, one might think of some of the Frankfurt School's work, and perhaps particularly, not directly the Frankfurt School, but with Adorno involved, the authoritarian personality study. But all those studies that rely on socialisation processes to understand the way in which a certain type of character is formed, and then once formed stays as a stable characteristic and persists throughout the life cycle, so that early socialisation, etc., becomes the very primary task in terms of trying to understand social processes, or indeed, as was part of the motivation behind the authoritarian personality study, in trying to inoculate society against becoming pre-fascist. What I want to suggest is that there's another way to read psychoanalysis, and Freud himself provides us with this. And it's there in the group psychology, for instance. This is one place that it's there. And so I'll say a little bit about this and then move towards finishing off. If one reading of psychoanalysis can support a socialisation approach that eventually centres the subject in a certain set of personality characteristics that are congruent with, indeed that match, the functional requirements for the reproduction of the society, there are other ways of reading Freud. Freud himself makes all this quite clear in his group psychology and the analysis of the ego. It's one of Freud's later pieces, written in 1921, and it relies on what we might characterise as a more elaborate theory of psychical operations than his earlier work. In it, indeed, we see an early version of what becomes the structural theory of the mind as outlined a couple of years later in The Ego and the Id. It's also important that Freud develops his concept of identification, which he had been developing for quite a while, from about 1914 in the Wolfman case, but he develops it in a very detailed way in group psychology. It is group psychology and the analysis of the ego. His work during this period from about 1914 through the 20s was going through a number of changes, and whilst a concern with the drives and repression remained, he became much more interested in understanding the relation to what he calls the object. So object relations start to become much more central, and the way in which we relate to the object, that is others. Others may be other people, the parents, the sisters and brothers, the friends and etc., the loved ones, etc. But they may also be social ideals, social norms, various images of self that the society presents to us. He writes of the group psychology only rarely and under certain exceptional conditions is individual psychology in a position to disregard the relations of the individual to others. And we've got this quote up here. In the individual's mental life, someone else is invariably involved as a model, as an object, as a helper, as an opponent. And so from the very first, individual psychology is at the same time social psychology as well. He wants to suggest that the theory that he'd previously developed working with regard to individuals can be extended onto the social in a very thoroughgoing way. But it's interesting the way this actually works itself out. So he accepts the characteristic accounts of the way groups or masses operate, that they're excessively emotional, impulsive, violent, fickle, etc. He takes that from the extant literature of the time. He grants that that's a fair account, but he wants to ask the question, what it is that turns a collection of individuals into a group or into a mass. He argues that libidinal drives or love instincts or emotional ties, which have been diverted from their original aims, lie at the root of group psychology, just as they lie at the root of individual psychology. Then he talks about a psychic mechanism of identification. The mutual tie between members of a group is in the nature of an identification based upon an important emotional common quality, the nature of the tie with the leader. Now, I've given you a quote here from The Language of Psychoanalysis, which is almost word for word what I would have written myself, but I thought it was better to quote. In Freud's work, the concept of identification comes little by little to have the central importance which makes it not simply one psychical mechanism among others, but the operation itself whereby the human subject is constituted. So, now identification is becoming very central. One of the stories he tells in the group psychology, which I'll report very quickly, is about a group of schoolgirls at a boarding school. One of the girls has imagined that she has this love affair with a young man who lives in one of the nearby cities. And then she receives a letter from him, which treats her as it were, one of his best friends, and tells her about this romance that he's having back home. Now, she's terribly disappointed by this. She is crushed, having imagined herself as his beau, as it were. So she has a kind of hysterical fit, as Freud puts it. Now, there's nothing that surprising about that part of the story, of course. But then a very strange thing does happen. amongst her group of friends, the rest of them, the other girls, have the same hysterical fit. They take on the same malady or illness. They become like the original girl in the story. Freud argues that what's going on here is an identification with the original girl, because of the desire to have, like her, the desire to have a romantic attachment. To be no longer the meek schoolgirl, but rather the amorous young woman. What we notice then is that in this setting, just as in the story for all of us, just as with the story of the Ratman, we've got a kind of regression happening. So if these various girls at the school have, of course, gone through a whole series of processes whereby they've formed a degree of psychic organisation, probably a fairly stable degree of psychic organisation in most cases, what we see in this little example is its undoing, a kind of regression, its displacement. And it's here that Freud tells us we have an example of the way groups, but not just groups, but also institutions work. So he talks about emergent groups, sort of crowds and whatever, but he also talks about the church and the army. He intends then to be referring to the whole panoply of social institutions. And what he's suggesting is that through a reorganisation of psychic structure along the lines of a displacement of our psychic structure at the level of what he calls the superego, or at this stage the ego ideal, and then as an identification across the range with the other members of the group, what we see is a reorganisation of psychic structure in the here and now. Now, I've taken a while to get to this point because what I want to finish with is simply to point out that here we have a story which is much more dynamic than one which would tell you that we're socialised in childhood, we form this very stable, almost frozen form of psychic structure which then persists and which then is repeated, enhanced throughout life. Rather, in the emergent contingencies of the here and now, psychic structure, through this ongoing process of identification, is formed and reformed. And hence we can see the way in which power and authority play through and continue to play through the formation of the subject. The other aspect of this, which he takes up in Civilization and its Discontents, he says it's always possible to bind together a considerable number of people in love so long as there are other people left over to receive the manifestations of their aggressiveness. And continues. Now here we're seeing one of the payoffs of psychoanalysis for the study of social and political relations. If in becoming a somewhat civilised subject, that process that we all go through, we are at the same time achieving that through repressions, through identifications, through projections, which disown aspects of our own feelings, of our own ways and preferences for being in the world and relating to others, our own ways of construing violence or power or authority. If some aspect of that needs to be repressed, then with the return of the repressed, one way in which it will play out in the social field is to attach to various groups and organisations that it will dehumanise or delegitimate or say are less entitled or should be excluded or whatever. So a series of processes then that at the level of ideologies create a world in which organisation and a sense of being civilised is realised through the projection onto others, dehumanised or denigrated others, of those aspects of ourselves that we have repressed and disowned. So I should perhaps finish with a little story about the Ratman, Ernst. He was eventually, as it were, cured sufficiently by Freud to be able to marry Gisela, to finish his law degree, etc. But then, with the First World War, he went off to fight and was killed, experiencing, as it were, now violence, aggressivity, hostility, all the things that Sid was talking about, but now in the West.